This episode of Moontower Business is brought to you by your local State Farm agent, Alejandra de la Torre. Alejandra's team has amazing customer service, knowledgeable staff, and super competitive pricing. They also have a very convenient location in Round Rock, located at 2200 North A.W. Grimes Boulevard, Suite 500. Alejandra's team is bilingual, and they have over 52 years of combined experience in the insurance industry. Alejandra's team is very friendly and helpful, and they always go the extra mile. They even have after-hours emergency availability. So please call Alejandra's State Farm team for all of your insurance needs, whether it's auto, home, life, or business. Their telephone number is 512-244-3311, or you can see their website at www.alexdelatorre.net. Welcome back, everybody, to the Moontower Business Podcast. This is your host, Joseph Obel, and today I have the privilege of speaking to Lord Fusitu'a, who is a member of Parliament of the Kingdom of Tonga. Welcome. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you, Joseph. I appreciate the invite. I feel privileged to be here, and looking forward to a good chat.
Yes, sir. Looking forward to it. Maybe we can kick off by you. Maybe just start out by introducing yourself to listeners and tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and things you've been involved in the past.
Yeah. So my name's Lord Fusitu'a. I'm what's called a Lord Member of Parliament in the Kingdom of Tonga. It's similar to a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom or a senator in the US. But we don't have a separate House of Lords and House of Commons. We have one unicameral house called the Legislative Assembly, where we have both people's representatives elected by universal suffrage from the general population, 17 of them, and 9 Lord members. So in a House of 26, they are always guaranteed to be able to form a government themselves. Although we have no political parties, everyone's an independent, or they can have a government, national unity with the Lords. So that's by career, I'm a politician, but by vocation, I'm an attorney, a barrister and solicitor under British Commonwealth common law jurisdictions. That's what we're known as. I began my career in Australia as a public defender after graduating from law school and grad school, as well as in a barrister's chambers doing civil litigation and criminal defence. It was very interesting. Mainly, he was the prolific lawyer in the defence of organised crime in Australia. So, yeah, very interesting work. Eventually, I was called back to Tonga, as is our duty after studying on a government scholarship, to come back and serve the nation as a Crown prosecutor initially. Then I moved over to the administrative side of the Ministry of Justice and became the Deputy Secretary of Justice and the Secretary of our Law Reform Committee, which is the equivalent of a law reform commission in other jurisdictions, which vets all government's legislation before it gets put to the legislature. I then went into the private sector and became General Counsel for a satellite company. As you may know, under ITU telecommunications law, only a sovereign nation can register satellite space. A company can't. And Tonga has a number of prime slots over Asia and the Pacific, which are registered by the government but were marketed by the satellite company that I worked for. So we dealt with Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Intelsat, the NSA, the CCP, Google, a number of internet tech companies. So it was a fairly broad experience. And I also worked as a consultant, a legal consultant to the government, and represented, ironically, as we'll get to later, I am still the attorney under retainer for Western Union in the South Pacific. the company that owns Western Union in Tonga, and throughout the South Pacific, I'm their barrister. And then in 2014, my father passed away, and per our constitution and our land tenure system, we have 33 houses of the nobility with hereditary titles which come with the hereditary estate. So I inherited that from my father, who was the sitting member in Parliament for my constituency. And at a by-election, I was elected to replace him and have been re-elected at 3 national general elections since. I'm currently in New Zealand because I was here for medical treatment and then got stuck here when our borders were closed for COVID. And while I was in hospital, I had life-saving surgery. I died clinically twice, was revived, and having had contact with Bitcoin since 2013, I found myself in 6 to 8 months on my back in hospital, immobile, unable to move. So I decided then to read every word that had been printed about Bitcoin, every word been recorded, every image that had been recorded, and studied it 24 hours a day. So I came to the realisation, I hope I'm not going too far into your questions and pre-answering them, but I realised in that study that Bitcoin in the developed world would be an asset that would appreciate at a never before seen exponential level and would form, it's the soundest money and the hardest, most pristine asset man has ever invented or stumbled across, depending on what your version of the Genesis may be with Satoshi et al. And would be very likely the first access to capital on an affordable level that people who look like you and me in the United States would have had for generations. They would previously have been legislated out of access to real estate, which is in the United States is the foundation for generational wealth. And then they would have been red zoned out of areas where they could accrue real estate of any worth. And then with bank loans, usually weren't given to them access to capital. The point is not whether that was good or bad. The point is that Bitcoin provides instant access to capital very cheaply for those who may not have had it previously, and could be the foundation for generational wealth in the first world. But in the developed world where I'm from, you don't have to wait for 5 years. It can change paradigms of entire nations right now. Bitcoin, Lightning on the Bitcoin rails with Strike can free the 4.5 billion people in emerging markets from the bondage of the remittance industry. Western Union, MoneyGram, who scrape value. I've learnt from Mexican people who've been migrating for longer than we have. Their testimonies of 5 generations of paying 30% to Western Union every time they send money to Mexico. That adds up into billions that could have been saved had they been sent with Strike over the Lightning Network, going cross borders with no intermediaries, peer-to-peer, in a nanosecond for a tenth of a penny. That can completely free nations from the remittance industry. So, yeah, that's where we're at. I hope I haven't done the whole interview in one monologue. But
No,
yeah,
that was perfect. I appreciate that. And you have an amazing, interesting background. And I want to touch on some points as your career as an attorney, a barrister, solicitor. But maybe go step back a little bit and talk about, I know you said you you were on your hospital bed and you spent a lot of time learning about Bitcoin. But I guess what triggered the interest in Bitcoin, number one, and I guess, and number two, what were the best like resources that you found that gave the best information about Bitcoin when you were reading about it?
I came across it in 2013. A cousin of mine, who is like my brother, we grew up with, he moved to America. I'm not sure if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, Sinclair computers back in the early 80s. They built a computer called the ZX Spectrum in 1980, personal computer. He and I taught one another to code in BASIC. There was no operating system. So, we'd be nerds, computer nerds from way back. So he moved to America. In 2013, he called me and said, there's this awesome protocol. You're gonna want to be in on it. I know, because I know we like the same things. You can't get any there, but I'll get some for us. And then when I come over, Tongans all gather back in Tonga from the diaspora during Christmas and New Year. So when I get there for Christmas, I'll show you how. So he gets there for Christmas and I'm like, so the Bitcoin, where is it? And he tells me, so about that, if you remember, Bitcoin went up to about $200 in 2013. So it was a decent price, and he bought a lot when it was only about a dollar. So he said, I ended up in a situation where I had a lot less money liquid than I thought I would have at the time. I was a little bit drunk and I kind of sold all our Bitcoin.
Oh, man.
So I was like, well, that's absolutely no use to me whatsoever. That was my first encounter with Bitcoin. It dangled very unkindly in front of me and then unsurreptitiously taken away. I read the white paper by then. I thought I'd had my head around it. I found out much later that I did not have my head around it at all. Then 3 years later, I was in Parliament by then, and a phenomenon which is common to us in the developing world, a very slick-talking American businessman in a Miami Vice suit promising that he's going to make millions for all of us if we just invest with him. So myself and a number of the lords did. He had some agricultural projects he was putting forth, so we invested in that. And he was a Bitcoiner. So he said, as soon as he said that, the guys, the other lords went, what's he talking about? And I said, no, trust me, you're going to want to be in on this. So we invested with him. He said, I'll go and buy it because you can't buy any here, and I'll custody it and get in touch with you and show you how you can get hold of it. So as these businessmen often do, he very graciously left and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again, with our agricultural investment money and our Bitcoin investment money. And I learned later that the price of Bitcoin he quoted us was about quadruple what the market price actually was at the time. So he took us not just for the Bitcoin, but for quadruple the actual price.
Oh, no.
So again, ripped away from me very unkindly. Then about 3 years ago, I went on a national tour as part of our Parliament's legislation committee to do public consultations on some constitutional amendments that were proposed, some new bills. So those public consultations means I go village by village around the country, holding a 4-hour session in the morning, 4-hour session in the evening, explaining to the people what the ramifications of the bill are, and then getting their input. As a transparent democratic process, they get input. They get the right to have input in what the law should say. So it was a fairly hectic tour. I got back and I collapsed. And I died clinically in Tonga. the ICU resources were barely sufficient to keep me alive. So they didn't have the resources to operate on me. So what they did was they tried to keep me alive for 36 hours while they searched the Pacific for an air ambulance. They rang Auckland, New Zealand, couldn't find one. Sydney, Australia, couldn't find one. They found one in Brisbane in Australia. It flew over, got me to Auckland and New Zealand, where I clinically died again. After 3 surgeries over 2 days, they were able to save my life, literally dragging me out of the grave. So after that, I was left having had the life-saving surgery, but I collapsed in Tonga in July and I woke up in New Zealand in September after being in a coma for 2 months. So that meant a 6 to 8 month stay in hospital on my back, unable to really move. I had breathing through a pipe that cut a hole in my throat and fed through a tube in my nose. I wasn't able to swallow, so I wasn't even allowed to drink water. I had to have IV fluids because I couldn't swallow. The liquid would go into my lungs. So there's nothing really to do when you're lying flat like that for 6 months but read. So that's when I read everything I could that there was to read about Bitcoin, about everything that I could find that was recorded, images that were broadcast, all the standards, the bullish case for Bitcoin, the Bitcoin standard, the sovereign individual. For me, crimes of an economic hitman because of being from emerging markets. I wanted a full breadth view of what Bitcoin is and would be, zoomed out on a global level, not just on a G7 or G20 developed world level. So, yeah, there were Bitcoin and Black America, Isaiah's book. I got a full breadth of reading. So, I guess I was fortunate. It was a blessing in disguise. Some people get orange pilled by someone who explains it to them. It took me dying clinically twice to get what Bitcoin, and dying twice after learning about Bitcoin. Dying twice was well worth it. It was a small price to pay to what Bitcoin can do for my country and for the world.
That's wild, and that's crazy. You went through all that stuff, and I'm glad that you're here. We're talking today, and I'm glad you're in your better health. So you mentioned earlier a little bit. It sounds like in the early days, it wasn't. You couldn't purchase Bitcoin in Tonga. What does it look like today? What does Bitcoin look like today in Tonga? Can you buy it? What exchanges are there in Tonga that are available to purchase Bitcoin? And then what are your fellow lords in Parliament? What are their thoughts on Bitcoin right now?
No, there's still no exchanges in Tonga. So if you physically reside in Tonga, the only way you can buy Bitcoin is if you have overseas bank accounts, which will be accepted by foreign exchanges. So, for instance, myself, I have Tongan, New Zealand, Australian, and American bank accounts, so I'm able to access any exchanges that accept fiat from banks in those countries. So that's pretty much what everyone in Tonga has to do. But we have been sending remittances back to warm wallets for a while now. Because even on the base layer, even on layer 1, with the higher fees, it's still 4 to 10x cheaper than Western Union. So we send them back to our relatives there. And 5% of our population is now ethnically Chinese. When Hong Kong went back to China in 1997, a lot of Hong Kong businessmen fled with their money to try and set up business elsewhere. and Tonga was one of the places they came. We also have a large influx from the Guangzhou province in China. It's the southernmost province, and it's the largest origin point for tourism on the planet. It sends out 1.2 million tourists a year. So a lot of them come and set up businesses in Tonga. And they now dominate our retail sector. 99% of retail is Chinese. You will rarely see a Tongan retail store anymore. And the significance of that is, before we had a full embassy in China, I was with my ex-wife, the honorary consul in Beijing for a couple of years. And when you come out of a subway station or a bank, there are beggars sitting on the street with their hands out. For the past decade or so, when you come out on the street, the beggars are sitting there with a mobile phone out, because in China they transact in digital fiat and have for a while now. So the merchants in Tonga are used to transacting in digital fiat. So it was a very minor transition for them to accept sats, which they do now. So we send money to our relatives on a warm wallet. They go to the Chinese storefront. They can either purchase things with it or they can cash out. To the Chinese, it's just the same as accepting US dollars or Australian dollars. Technically speaking, when they cash out, they're really acting as a broker, which strictly speaking should require a financial operator's license. But to them, they are merely accepting another currency, as I said, just as they would USD or AUD, which they accept at face value. So if you turn up with a bunch of USD, they'll say, yeah, you can buy stuff with it, but we'll only give you face value. When actually one USD is worth about 3 of our dollars, they'll say, no, just dollar for dollar. So accepting sats and Bitcoin, to them it's just another currency that they're accepting. They're not partaking in any financial brokerage of any sort. So, yeah, that's the level of adoption at the moment. The other lords, I'm the only barrister amongst the lords. I'm the only barrister in the whole parliament. So the brethren, they take my advice on financial and legal policy matters. So when I explained it to them, 200% CAGR year on year since 2009 isn't a bad prospect when it's held up against USD melting at 5%, negative yielding bonds, and the possibility of inflation. And especially with an economy like ours, who's dependent 41% GDP on remittances. So nearly half of the capital in our economy is from remittances abroad. So Bitcoin solves that issue like nothing else.
Do you see Tonga making any moves in Bitcoin in the future? Maybe putting it on as in the treasury or as a reserve asset?
That's a good question. My plan is Nayib Bukele's blueprint is the perfect one for the emerging markets. The commercial solution of Strike on the Lightning Network, you don't need an act of parliament or endorsement from the central bank for that. All it is everyone downloads Strike on their phone, and these Chinese vendors download Strike on their POS, and you transact. Adoption will require a bill, which I've already drafted. I was fortunate enough to get an early copy of the El Salvadorian bill from the team there, and it's public now, but I was able to do what's called a gap analysis, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to match it up against our national legislation and where there are any contradictions between the two, to resolve them, to ensure that when the bill's introduced, it's compliant with all our constitution and our current legislation. So the bill is ready to go. It's ready to be presented to Parliament. But unfortunately, I can't get into the country yet. Our borders are hard locked until March 2022. Tonga is one of the 10 nations in the Pacific who are still zero COVID since the beginning. They've never had a COVID case. It's one of the few times that having a being a small, isolated island is a benefit. There are very few times that's an advantage. This, fortunately, is one of them. So as soon as I can get in the country and Parliament is in session, then I'll be able to present it. Parliament will only be in session for another week this year. We usually go till October, but there's a national general election this year. And the Lords, our election takes about 30 minutes. We just go to the Palace office and there's an election amongst ourselves. But we have to give the people's reps time to do their campaigning. So we give them September, October to travel around the country doing their campaigning. And then the national general election is in November. The day of the election, all the nobles go to the Palace office and sit there. And our election, as I said, there's only 33 of us. So it takes half an hour. And then we wait for 2 days for the national results to come out. So, yeah, Bitcoin friendly, very much. The question about treasuries, that's a great question. You'll see El Salvador didn't do that, and deliberately so, because in the developing world, most of us hold our foreign reserves in USD. So all the export dollars we make, the tourist dollars we make, we hold them in USD. It's one of the metrics that emerging markets count in measuring their economic development. So the issue with putting it on the treasuries is that's a speculative attack on the US dollar. The Fed will take that as a conscious choice. You are saying that we regard Bitcoin as a safer reserve asset than the US dollar, which is obviously the case de facto, in fact. But geopolitically, there's those things you have to tread carefully.
It's going to be exciting to see that, to follow the bill when you present it to Parliament. Really excited to follow how that goes.
Yeah, I'll keep you updated, man. I'm very excited for it. I've got a British filmmaker contacted me, and he's begun filming. He wants to film the process from now all the way through till the bill gets passed. So my negotiations with whoever now, the dialogue with Jack Mallers and Strike for the commercial solution, everything. So it'll be an interesting documentary which he's hoping to put together.
Very exciting. Want to switch gears a little bit to El Salvador. I was just there last month. I went to El Zante for a couple of weeks, and it was exciting to be there with other Bitcoiners. I downloaded the Strike app. I was able to buy just regular everyday stuff with Bitcoin, and just to see that in real life was really exciting. What are your thoughts on the Bitcoin law in El Salvador? I know it's going into effect, I think, in a couple of weeks. Will be formal law that is currency. Generally speaking, do you think it's going to succeed? What do you think are the biggest challenges they're going to have with that?
I think it's brilliant. It's a beautiful thing. The bill is brilliant. Its intentions are sincere and brilliant. The implementation, the wording of the bill, its structure is very sensible and forward-looking. The policy initiatives that are encapsulated in the bill make a lot of sense economically for El Salvador, and I think it will be a success. It will reclaim the portion of wealth that is lost to Western Union and the remittance industry. That's a no-brainer. That's a very easy win, low-hanging fruit. So El Salvador is at about 20% GDP dependence on remittances. Bukele has forecasted 27% GDP growth by December, and he's already 2/3 of the way there, much of it due to the introduction of Bitcoin. I think their largest challenges will be education, because there is you may have noticed when you're there is a fairly strenuous propaganda campaign against Bukele and the bill because the people that own Western Union, just like my clients in the Pacific, are rich and very powerful people, and they're very upset with Bitcoin because it's taking hundreds of millions of dollars away from their fortunes. So they will try and run the bill down any way possible. International legacy media, backed by the US, is doing the same. Reuters does a hit piece on Bukele every second day. There was a list of people, leaders in South America that are least liked by the US. He wasn't even on the list, but Reuters put his photo on as the lead of the article, just to give him a bad name. So Bukele's a don. He's a gangster. He's a G. He doesn't take a backward step. On Twitter, he tweeted United Fruit Company. And anyone that knows about South America will know that was a US-backed multinational that was rife with corruption, setting up dictators throughout the Central America. So he's saying, this is a little bit rich coming from you guys. So, yeah, he's awesome. The guy's inspiring. And, yeah, it'll be education because of that propaganda campaign and because, like Tonga, there is a large portion of the country which is rural, in villages, as you know, and you have to get out there. Cell phone coverage is not universal there. So you have dropouts of internet connectivity, which obviously you need for Strike to work. So the two main things will be education and some slight infrastructure rollout, which is easy doable. And he's a smart guy. I'm inspired by it. He's the first millennial head of state. So he's a guy in his 30s who's got the vision of someone my age. So, yeah, awesome.
Yeah, I mean, he's inspiring. He is. I think, it's really cool to see how young he is. He's very smart. He gets it. And exciting to see how quickly that got passed and adopted. And I agree with you with the challenges. I think education is probably one of the biggest ones, right? I mean, I fell down the rabbit hole, and it took me. I mean, I know like a sliver, right, of information about Bitcoin, and I think that it takes people a long time to kind of really get their minds around what Bitcoin is, how it functions, et cetera. So I think that's probably going to be a big challenge, but I think they're doing a good job. I follow a lot of the guys on from El Zante, Bitcoin Beach, the Hope House, that are really getting the word out there and getting the community and teaching people about what it is and how it works.
And that's the great thing about Strike is you don't have to know anything about Bitcoin because you don't have to touch Bitcoin at all if you don't want. The sender can send it in fiat, get switched to Bitcoin under the hood. Zip uses the advantage of the Lightning Network to zip cross borders in a second and then gets flipped back into fiat to the receiver. So neither of them know they've used the Bitcoin rails at all. So you can use it that way if you want, as you know, or you can go long Bitcoin. Also, the education, if you're in the Twitter spaces, Bitcoin Twitter spaces a lot, you'll see a guy named Abelito, who is a former advisor to the president of Panama and had a hand in the bill that's been mentioned, their cryptocurrency bill. He reminded us, you've also got to educate the people sending the money from the States so that they understand how they are making savings. So previously, in order for the guy in El Salvador to get $100, you'd have to send 130 from the States. So Western Union eats the 30 and the 100 gets there. If you just send 100, Western Union eats the 30 and the guy in El Salvador only receives 70. So the cost gets eaten at either the origin or the destination. So we have to educate the remitters as well as to the advantages of Bitcoin so that they actually do adopt Strike, because it's no use if the person in El Salvador's got Strike, if the person sending the money hasn't got Strike and doesn't understand Bitcoin, you've got to educate them as well. So that's something that Abelito reminded us of, and that's a great point. So in diaspora communities abroad, Bitcoiners in that diaspora have to be proactive in educating their neighbours and their compatriots about Strike. And these things in diaspora communities travel by word of mouth like lightning. Once someone uses it and goes, geez, I was able to actually get $100 to El Salvador without my aunt taking a 5-hour bus ride to Western Union, getting mugged by the gangs and getting home with only 50 of the $100. I can just send it from my phone to her phone. She doesn't have to take one step. That travels like wildfire by word of mouth. Education for the remitters as well will be important.
Absolutely. After the El Salvador law was announced by the president by Bitcoin 2021, and people started talking about it, I started seeing a lot of stuff on Twitter about other countries that were thinking about following suit. I think Panama and Brazil were a couple of them. What have you heard on that front? And who do you predict you think would be the next country? It sounds like Tonga's going to do it soon, but heard anything, or do you know of any others that might be announcing soon?
I have colleagues in the legislatures in Panama, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, Tanzania, Ethiopia. All these countries are one step away from having a bill in Parliament. For example, the Tanzanian president simply isn't messing around. She just went to the central bank and said, do the paperwork that's necessary to take on Bitcoin as legal tender. Very proactive pro-Bitcoin legislators throughout emerging markets. And you'll see these are all developing world countries because for us, it's almost not a choice. In Venezuela, with hyper-Bitcoinization, where you need a wheelbarrow of paper currency to buy a loaf of bread, or in Colombia, where there's currency debasement, so that, like in Zimbabwe, you have $1 trillion bills, or in Tonga, Uzbekistan, the Philippines, India, and China is the highest of all, who are remittance dependent. It's almost not a choice; it's a necessity. Bitcoin is our savior. We need it to survive. So I think you'll find emerging market, developing world nations will be FOMOing, not wanting to be the last one to get in. Once the second and the third go in, you'll see a flood. Bitcoin, Strike on the Lightning Network, in emerging markets, the 4.5 billion people there will propel Bitcoin adoption globally over the next decade. The numerical volume of that 4.5 billion outweighs the West by an exponential factor. And emerging markets and Strike on the Lightning Network and other Lightning wallets will propel Bitcoin adoption globally for the next decade.
MicroStrategy this week announced they bought more Bitcoin, which is exciting to see.
I saw that.
That's good stuff, man. So what do you think about institutions generally getting more on board? I mean, I know there's already quite a few public companies in the U.S. What are we going to see going forward?
100%. Well, Goldman Sachs, the granddaddy, is the perfect example. Matthew McDermott, the head of global digital assets at Goldman Sachs, is quoted as saying, Bitcoin is in an asset class of its own. And I think his quote was, it's a privilege to witness the emergence of an entirely new asset class. So they regard it in a class of its own and are investing in it heavily. Another example is Joey Diamond, Jamie Dimon, in 2017, you'll remember his famous quote that any of my traders who touch Bitcoin will be fired on the spot. And then that weekend, very quietly, JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley were the largest buyers of Bitcoin XBTs and ETNs in the entire European market. So if that were a stock or a commodity, he would have gone to jail. You're not allowed to make statements like that to dip the price and then take advantage of it. So that gives you a sign that JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley are into it. Goldman Sachs is. NIDIG obviously is serving as the conduit between a lot of, with all due respect, boomer money that doesn't want to buy the asset directly yet, but will invest in XBTs, ETNs in the States, not yet. The 20 ETF applications that are there haven't been approved yet. My feedback from my US congressional and senatorial colleagues is that they're going to wait until there's a regulatory legislative scheme around the base asset first, around Bitcoin first, and then maybe grant the ETNs. Although I'm hearing whispers this week, sort of ETFs, that there might be some ETF approval, whereas previously I'd been told that they were going to wait to regulate the base asset. So the reason that that's an issue is because there is such a large institutional move into Bitcoin. So as you know, in the States, Bitcoin is regulated by that quadrangle that is yet to be resolved. A commodity, a pseudocity to the CFTC, an asset that accrues capital gains to the IRS, and then a money to law enforcement, which is why you get KYC AML'd. So that four-pronged existence of Bitcoin straddling those four different regulatory agencies, because it is not entirely one thing or the other, needs to be resolved. And that will propel institutional adoption even further. And then you have a nation-state adoption, which is the gold standard, pardon the pun, of adoption. So you've got countries like here, New Zealand, their national pension fund called the Kiwi Saver, which is the government's pension fund for the entire country, has taken 5% of their treasuries and bought Bitcoin with it. The United States, Biden has given the IRS $80 billion and advertised 37,000 new jobs to try and get a regulatory and taxation scheme around Bitcoin. So it's not adopted yet, but it's most definitely recognised. And then, of course, we have El Salvador, who's adopted it as legal tender. So we've got individual, retail adoption, institutional adoption, commercial bank adoption, nation-state adoption. So Bitcoin is a store of value, the best store of value that there is in the first world. As Michael Saylor likes to say, it's better at being fiat than fiat is. It's better at being gold than gold is. And it's my contention that with Taproot, Layer 2 and Layer 3, it'll be better at being altcoin than altcoin is. So, yeah, a very peaceful but unstoppable revolution. It's an immutable force that is coming. Geopolitically, it is the United States' best chance at holding on to world reserve currency status as the USD begins to falter and China pushes the digital yuan into emerging markets, and the vast influence it now has in emerging markets, vying for the status of world reserve currency. And then there are the CBDCs who are coming, which are worst possible of both worlds. It takes the unlimited printing of paper fiat and combines it with the ability to monitor, trace, time lock or expiry date a digital currency and puts them together in the worst possible combination. And Bitcoin, again, fixes that. So, yeah, I couldn't be more bullish.
You mentioned ETFs in the US, and I've heard the same thing. There's quite a few applications in the pipeline that haven't been approved yet.
Yes.
And it's going to be big to see what happens when one is approved. I mean, I've heard talk about institutions and things like pension funds that are not allowed, their rules don't allow them to invest in Bitcoin right now, but if ETF is approved, money could pour into Bitcoin in that way and can really drive the price up.
100. The second all that institutional money, and as I said, with all due respect, I called it boomer money, that is worth billions. And when that capital goes into Bitcoin, the chance of Bitcoin becoming a unit of account increase by the day with that investment. I mean, obviously, in the G7 and the G20 countries, they'll be the last to fall because they have very entrenched central bank systems. We have very much younger central banks. Our central banks are maybe 40, 50 years old. So they're not too hard to displace. Unfortunately, they're mostly headed by Keynesian economists who went to the West and got educated and came back and subjugated their own people to the international central banking system, which was a bit silly. But despite the fact that they'll be the last to fall, as you said, with the approval of the ETFs, there will be entire, as you said, pension funds of industries, national pension funds of an entire nation state that will pour into Bitcoin. So, yeah, that's a very good take.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. You talked a little bit earlier about your work as an attorney. That was exciting stuff. Maybe you can kind of touch on some of the things that you really enjoyed the most about being an attorney, the type of work that you did that really stood out.
So public defender began in Australia. It was great to be able to represent people who can't afford legal representation. In the public defender's office, if a case comes in with an accused that you have some interest or relation to, you obviously have to recuse yourself. So I ended up leaving because too many of my friends and relatives were coming through. I had to keep recusing myself on every second case. I knew nearly every second person that was coming through. But that was extremely rewarding. Then working at barristers' chambers, as I said, very controversially, he is in Australia, a gentleman by the name of Jack Pappas, brilliant barrister. But he represents the Hells Angels, the Comancheros, a number of Italian and Lebanese families. So towing that very fine line between legal representation and your own ethics as to whether you feel you should represent this person or not. Every person deserves a fair trial, a hearing in court, and legal representation. That's at the very basis of our legal systems in liberal democracy. But the fact situations were very interesting there, as they were when I moved directly back from there to Tonga and became a criminal prosecutor. One of the funniest cases, land in Tonga is inalienable, so it's illegal to sell it to foreigners or even Tongans amongst each other. There is no freehold land at all. All land is inherited. So under our land tenure system, every male who reaches the age of 16 and is of full capacity is granted for free by the state a 1/4 acre of land in an urban area to build a house and 8 acres of land in a rural area to farm and feed himself. So just free. You just get given it for free. You just rock up and go, I want my free land. And by law, because the king and the lords own most of the land, that comes out of our personal land. By law, we can't say no. We have to give it to them. It's why Tongans are terrible with rent and mortgages when they go overseas, because they think land's supposed to be free. So we had an elderly American couple, Helen and Michael Bowe, who rented a resort island of a couple of 100 acres, a very successful resort, very quiet couple. But we'd only ever seen it from the ocean, as the flights to that island group did not fly over that island. And we don't have helicopters, so we never had an aerial view. But someone stumbled across the fact that apart from the beachfront, which was a resort, the rest of the island was entirely indica and sativa, but fully fresh, very resinous buds, hundreds of acres of it. This elderly American couple from the Midwest were the cannabis kingpins of Tonga without knowledge. We had our knowledge, and it was one of my first cases prosecuting them and seeing them in court. The jury fell in love with them, but I managed to convince them to get a conviction. So that's fairly interesting. Being on the Law Reform Committee, Secretary of the Law Reform Committee, and Deputy Secretary of the Ministry, gave me a feel for administrative law and administering a legal system and a judicial system, because the judiciary is under the Ministry of Justice. So we choose the judges, we budget for their salaries, we give them their policy briefings. So that was very interesting. And then moving into the private sector as general counsel for this satellite company, that's also very an eye-opener, because you're negotiating deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars every day. When Lockheed and Boeing put a bird in the sky, that's a $500 million project. And your fees, even 1% of that is a fair bit of money. So that was an eye-opener, both financially for myself, but also in my perception of job satisfaction, because I still got more satisfaction about seeing a mother get her daughter out of a life of bad decisions by being a public defender to her. That was more satisfying than any bank account filling work that I did with the satellite company. Not that it wasn't interesting, because it's my field, telecommunications law, and there's a lot of intellectual property, because, we're working with companies who say, our bird was the first version of the bird, and Intelsat's saying, no, you've infringed our patents. You can't build a bird using those specs without paying us some money. So, that was fascinating as well. And then now transitioning into politics, as I said, being a lord, being a traditional leader from birth, politicians have 4-year terms. My service to my people as a protector, providing them with land, making sure they have access to healthcare, education. My term goes from the cradle to the grave. It's from birth to death. My responsibility and duties to them for my entire life. So transitioning that into public office is not really difficult, because that's our job anyway, is to provide for our people.
That's a pretty diverse background in law. It sounds pretty interesting. It's interesting to see attorneys now focusing more on Bitcoin stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that you don't really think about, like estate planning and tax consequences. And so do you think that you're going to see more lawyers kind of just focusing straight on Bitcoin matters?
Yeah. In Twitter Spaces, I don't know how many times, I'm not even from the US, I've had to say Roth IRA, self-directed LLC. That's where you're going to get your maximum benefit from. So, yeah, there's going to be a whole industry. I don't know if you've seen on Twitter Spaces a guy named Jared Pierce. His handle is at Bitcoin Planner. His entire practice is just that, estate planning, helping clients minimize their tax burden for their Bitcoin. And the great thing about, as you would well know, the Roth IRA with an LLC, self-directed IRA with an LLC that you own running it, is that you only pay tax going in, but you don't pay tax going out. So if the value of Bitcoin has skyrocketed, you're not paying tax when you cash out on the other end.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we most of us maxis, that's a non-issue because we're hodling forever. I mean, my Bitcoin is not for me; it's for the next generation. Is to ensure that my children and my descendants have a sufficient amount of them. There are only 21 million of them. There are 8 billion of us. There are 45 million millionaires on the planet. So, yeah, it would make sense to get as much of that 21 million for yourself and your people and your country as possible.
No doubt. A couple of final questions here before we wrap up. Number one, for folks that don't have any exposure to Bitcoin, are just intrigued and want to get started, maybe buy a little bit, what kind of advice would you give to them? And then secondly, what's your price prediction for the end of the year?
Right. As you probably know, don't do price because we really don't care what the price is. It's one Bitcoin's worth one Bitcoin, and the fiat price is irrelevant. But I'll give you a prediction. What we've found is my team has begun firstly by doing financial literacy workshops in the villages because I found from my personal experience that Bitcoin makes more sense if you understand what money is and how money works, which most of us don't. Financial literacy is hard to come by. It's deliberately kept out of the curriculum of our educational systems because those behind the fiat central banks, lions don't teach hyenas how to be lions. They eat hyenas and keep the knowledge of being lions to themselves. So I have Harvard MBA colleagues who have no financial literacy whatsoever because they were never taught it. So teaching people the fundamentals of money, and then through trial and error, we've found that things like Moon Wallet, Wallet of Satoshi, Lightning Wallets are the best onboarding tool. Explaining to someone the white paper and getting them to buy 0.00001 Bitcoin is not as easy as saying download Moon Wallet, which is KYC free. So there's no barriers to entry. They can do it within 5 minutes and I can hit them with 20,000 Satoshis on the spot. They're off zero and they can get their head around this thing called Bitcoin because, hey, 20,000 of something in my hand makes a lot of sense. So that is my best advice to someone getting into it. Get off zero. The cheapest place to buy Bitcoin now is through the Strike app because Jack's set fees at 0.3% and they're going down to 0.1% by October. So get the Strike app. You can send money on it. You can buy Bitcoin. And it's extremely easy to send back and forth between others. Obviously, from there, straight into cold storage, learn the principles of self-custodying. I was approached in a clubhouse room by a USC economics professor, a Keynesian economist, And he said, in fiat, the state enforces my property rights. And his point was to make Bitcoin look bad, to say, well, no one enforces your property rights in Bitcoin. And he said, so who enforces your property rights? And he was surprised when I said I do. That's the whole point of Bitcoin, is that I'm sovereign over my money. But with that sovereignty comes responsibility, because I don't just have a commercial bank in my pocket, I have a central bank in my pocket, because I decide the supply, I decide the oscillation, I decide how much I'm going to sell or buy. So it's my responsibility to know that it's easy to buy off an exchange, and I can do so. But because I'm self-sovereign, I realise that I must know that it should go to a warm wallet as soon as possible, because at least then I actually own the Bitcoin. On an exchange, you're buying a fiat interest in someone else's Bitcoin. When you move it to a warm wallet, you have the private keys, and only then do you own the Bitcoin. And it's therefore also my responsibility to know that I should move that into cold storage, because then I reduce one attack vector by being connected to the internet. And I'm able to sign transactions only when required with a ledger or Trezor, or I can have it completely air-gapped with a cold card. And it's my responsibility to know, because I'm sovereign, that I should have my seed phrase etched on some kind of inflammable material, preferably metal, and I have triplicate of triplicates, copies of those. That's 3 times 3, that's 9 copies. 3 copies at my city residence, 3 at my country residence, 3 at my seaside residence. And then I have a 7 of 9 multi-sig set up using different hardware keys, and 1 with my lawyer, 1 with my accountant, both of whom are under a fiduciary duty to me, breach of which is punishable by imprisonment. They are used because they serve both as a key and the executor of my will should anything happen to me. So all those layers of security are because I'm self-sovereign. But the more interesting question that arose is, if I've done all that myself, then why should I pay the government any tax at all for an asset they give no assistance in securing or protecting? So he left with a befuddled look, because he couldn't answer that question. But that would be my general security advice from start to finish.
How about the price predictions?
The price prediction, I think, end of year, 6 figures.
That's what I'm thinking.
I won't precise number, but 6 figures by the end of the year.
Awesome. Lord Fusitu'a, thank you so much for taking time to be on the podcast. Really enjoyed our conversation. Exciting,
my pleasure, man.
Exciting stuff you're working on. I can't wait to see the bill unfold in Tonga. I'd love to stay in touch. I'd love to have you on the podcast again sometime. Yeah,
exactly. I was going to say, I hope this is the first of many conversations. I've made a new friend. Very pleasure to meet you, brother. And looking forward to keeping in touch in future and having more dialogue, both on Bitcoin and on the law, which I can tell we both have a passion for, and how the two are going to intertwine in the foreseeable future. I think that's a fascinating question.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. Take it easy.
This episode is brought to you by our affiliate Gemini. Gemini is a well-respected cryptocurrency exchange started by Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss. If you're interested in purchasing Bitcoin, Ethereum, or other altcoins, please check out their website at gemini.sjv.io/Moontower to learn all about it. Thank you.